Hey, everybody! We've got an extra lecturer here. This is my grandson, and now he's going to slowly edge his way out of the room. Welcome, everybody. This is our last discussion question for the summer session, and you'll notice that for this week, you only are going to be needing to read one chapter, chapter 15, which is on the Protestant Reformation and the Renaissance. And so, just stay focused on that before our final that opens, I believe, on Tuesday or Wednesday of next week and closes on Thursday. Okay, so what are we doing with this? Where do I want us to go with this? There's a lot to unpack with the Reformation and the Renaissance. So what we're going to do is what I want to do is create this mini lecture in such a way that you will see some trends that started during the Reformation and the Renaissance that are relevant to us in the 21st century and currently, important and relevant to us going forward. Most of these trends are something that you're going to read about going forward in your other history classes. If you transfer to a 4-year school, crossing over what we're doing right now when we're discussing the Protestant Reformation, we're also discussing the modern banking system, and we're going to look at Renaissance art and how it really reflects reality. All that is very much part and parcel of our world today. Our art reflects where we come from, our culture. It gives voice to what our beliefs are. So that all pretty much begins in the Renaissance in many ways. When we are entering into the Renaissance, we're looking at Western Europe in this mini lecture and this discussion board. And let's take a kind of a larger, broader look at what's going on in Western Europe. And we're going to start with religion. Religion is the first thing to really kind of crack here. So when we're beginning in the Renaissance, we're getting around the 1300s into the 1400s, then into the 1500s of the Protestant Reformation. We're looking at a time period where we have, as far as religion goes in Western Europe, there are Jewish people in Western Europe, very much separate to Christian people. Christians are primarily really Roman Catholicism. This is before 1500s, before the Protestant Reformation. We'll get to that. So you have Roman Catholicism, you have Judaism, and then you see the rise of Islam by the time we get to the 1300s for sure. 1492 in Spain, that has been reconquered by the King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, who are backed by the Pope. But prior to that, they were Spain and what was Portugal was part of the Islamic conquest that started in the late 600s, coming out of Saudi Arabian Peninsula, going up into what is modern-day Israel, eventually expanding even north, going into what was the Ottoman Empire, modern-day Turkey, and going east into what is modern-day India, creating the Mughal Empire in India, very Islamic. Islam spread east. Then Islam, with the original conquest, also spreads west along the northern coast of Africa, and then eventually comes into Spain and stays in Spain until it's reconquered by the under Christian rule. In North Africa, we've got Islam is the primary religion in North Africa, and between North Africa that's along the Mediterranean coast to about the middle part of Africa and the western coast, the Gold Coast, is the Saharan Desert. But because of the influences of the ancient Roman Empire that Islam really kind of moved into the the space that was left vacant and void by the old Roman Empire. It was not devoid, it was devoid of empire leadership, but it wasn't devoid of people, it wasn't devoid of culture, it was still very much part of the very vast trade networks that had been in existence really since the beginning of what we call civilization, the earliest river systems. So trade in from China to India to Mesopotamia to Africa had been going on for thousands of years, before the Muslims came up into those areas, and they just, like I say, they came in and they lived in those spaces, and so they also had access to the trade. And really, Islam gets started by Muhammad, who is a trader. So they're still very much part of the vast trading empire in the world, and that was there during the Roman Empire. And then it begins to move south in Africa below the Saharan desert, so sub-Sahara, and those trade routes come down into sub-Sahara Africa, and they go out to West Africa. So many of the Muslim African traders lived in and were influenced by Islam. By the time we're getting into the 1400s, 1500s for sure. So Islam is really spread out much farther, much more vast of a religion than is Catholicism, Roman Catholicism, and certainly Judaism is a very small speck of those groups. Now, religion is important because there's a lot of reasons. Religion is very emotional to us. It's emotional intelligence. Religion is man-made. It is, faith is not, but religion is. So religion is the way we practice and express our faith. And that's why you have so many different Christian groups even now. So with those different ways of expressing your faith, they are intermingled with different groups of people through trade, and new ideas begin to evolve, new offshoots of those those how to practice your faith, new offshoots of religion become part of new communities that are evolving out of the trade routes that were left over from ancient Rome, ancient Byzantine, and in Islam. And the network of people and ideas through trade really do affect and then begin to come into play within the Western Christian world. Now, when they come into play with the Western Christian world, they're coming in through trade, and the Roman Catholic Church, what they're coming into with the Roman Catholic Church is a very strong, very powerful church that is highly systematized based off of the old Roman systems of a republic. And in this time period of the 14 up to, even the Protestant Reformation, remember that Catholicism, Roman Catholicism, is the church body politic. It is the means to the end. So here you are, you're the person who's practicing Roman Catholicism, and here's God up here. Now, how do you get to God? Well, you get to God by practicing and participating in the sacraments. That's how you get grace to go up to God. Well, who can administer the sacraments? The priests administer the sacraments. So you have to have a priest around in order that they're the intermediary between you and God, which makes them very, very powerful. And with power comes corruption. Now, it is kind of part and parcel of being a human being. You can't look at the church or any religious group or any group in general, but when we're looking at religion, we're looking at it from the perspective of religion is a reflection not only of our faith, but our faith is also intermingled with what is good and what is evil. To be good is to be godly. You don't lie, cheat, and steal. These are all associated, those kinds of activities of misbehavior are associated with what is not good, and therefore what is not godly, really. So you're sinning, right? So if you are, if the church is the intermediary and they have the ability to absolve you of your whatever you're doing, misbehaving, then that gives them power. But of course, the church is only made up of human beings as well. So they too are subject to being human. Go figure. And so over time, the church, there are members of the church body politic, the priests, the cardinals, the bishops, all the people who, because it's very systematized. So the further up the scale, the more power you have. So by default, some of these guys, some, not all, but some of these guys became very corrupted. Popes who were not, there was celibacy in the 12th century, that obviously you had to take a vow of celibacy, you had to take a vow of poverty. There are different vows if you become a priest. It goes all the way up to the Pope. Everyone who is in the priesthood must take these vows. It also goes for women. Women become nuns they can become nuns in the Roman Catholic Church, but also in Episcopalian. There are different women who, or groups of women who live a holy life, and they join a convent. That's what it's called, instead of a monastery for a group of men live together. And different monasteries and different convents have different missions. If anybody watches Call the Midwife, you'll see that the women who run Nonnatus house are their patron saint is Nonnata, and that person is the patron saint of midwives. So midwifery, and that's why the mission of Nonnatus house is midwifery. So if you're watching Call the Midwife, you can see what I'm trying to explain here. Okay, so with that power comes corruption, and eventually that corruption leads to one of the church priests named Martin Luther coming to the forefront in Germany. And in 1517, and he nails onto the door of the church 95 basic thesis statements. 95, it's called the 95 Thesis. And what it is really a list of issues that Martin Luther believes the church needs to address. So he is protesting the church. I'm protesting the church like people are out protesting in the streets. He's protesting the church because what does he want? He wants reform in the church, just like we want social reforms. Why are people protesting in the streets? Because they want social reforms. They want the corruption that is inherent in the system to be removed from the system. That's exactly what Martin Luther was doing. He was protesting the corruption in the church, and he wanted reforms, and he was listing all these issues that he was protesting against. Well, okay, so Martin Luther was Catholic. He was a member of the Roman Catholic Church, and he was kind of fed up and tired of the church being corrupted and hurting people, because they were. So the church didn't really take to that very well, as you can imagine. He's in Germany. Martin Luther is German. He's in Germany when he does this. There's a big hullabaloo. Obviously, we can't get into that on a very short mini lecture. And at the end of the day, though, what ends up happening is a split in the church, in Christian church, in the Christian faith. So you have the Roman Catholic faith and religion still staying steady. And now you have a new branch of Christianity, which is Protestantism. Now, Martin Luther is the first to create this shift and this split. And he says that it is faith and faith alone that gets you into heaven. So what does that do? It takes out the middleman. Who needs a church? Who needs the priest? Who needs this? Because remember, he's thinking that it's because of how complex and systematized the Catholic Church is that leads to its power bubble, and it leads to that power bubble allowing for corruption. So Martin Luther says, who needs that power bubble? All you need is faith and faith alone, and you can go right to God. So the people right to God, have a direct relationship. Now, overall, that sounds really great. And there were a lot of people dancing in the street thinking, oh my gosh, I can lie, cheat, and steal. All I have to do is say, I believe in God, I have faith in God, and I'll be absolved from any of my bad behavior. And that did happen. And we'll get to that in just a second. But what also happens is that there's a reason why the Protestantism that is then called Lutheranism actually sticks. And part of the reason, and a big, big reason why it sticks, is because the princes and the lords, the people who are in power, who are still part of that old manorial system, the princes of principalities, local principalities, and the aristocracy who own other large land regions, they see money in this. To follow Luther and to follow Protestantism means that they're going to get land back, which gives them extra money. How does that happen? Well, in the old manorial system, as you read hopefully from last week, you'll find that the lord of the manor owns all the land. I mean, all the owns the forest, owns the animals in the forest. Why we get Robin Hood, a lot of stories. You're killing the king's deer, you're killing the lord's deer. This is everything on the land is owned by the lord of the manor, the aristocracy who own, of that family owns everything. So that means that they own all the farmland. People rent it. Peasants and farmers rent the land, and they give a percentage of what they grow or what they, butter or goods that they have off the land. They give part of that to the manor house, and or they sell part of those goods for real money to give to the manor house. In a town, as we see the rise of towns, you see the rise of civil law, and then but no one owns the buildings they live in. All those buildings, the whole town is really owned by the people who live in the manor. So they pay rents to them. That's what they're doing. And every year when the rents come around, you have to give them the rent. Now sometimes the rents could be in barter, but sometimes they couldn't. They had to be in coin. But it all went to the manor house, except for the church and the land around the church. Because the Roman Catholic Church had so much control over life or death, or whether someone was going to heaven or someone was going to hell, based on what they were giving to the church, how much they're tithing to the church. And the church did. They put it on their heads, and some people felt like they had to give the church land, Some people felt like it was an honor to give the church land, but for our purposes in this conversation, it's irrelevant why the land was given up for the church. But you need to know that that land that the church was on, even though it was part of the manor, the manor didn't own that land. They didn't own any. They had to give it up. They had to give it back, give it to the church. So all the tithing, any money that went into the church when parishioners went to church, all that money went to the church. It didn't go to the Lord. So now we have this Protestant Reformation, and the lords in the manorial system go, oh my goodness, I can take all those churches back. If I join the Protestant Reformation, what difference does it make? It's still Christian. If I join the Protestant Reformation, now I can get that land back. And ultimately, when Henry VIII creates the Anglican Church in England, one of the benefits from that is he becomes the largest landowner in Great Britain, and to this day, because he takes back all the churches. To this day, the Queen of England is the largest landholder in Great Britain. So it's, there's some things that are still very much part of the world today that started back after, right with the Protestant Reformation. Okay, so because these lords took on and said, yeah, I'm going to follow Martin Luther, and I'm going to I'm not going to be Catholic anymore, I'm going to be Lutheran now. Lutheranism really took solid hold in Germany. And in Germany, word got around pretty fast that, oh my gosh, you don't have to be worried about going to heaven or going to hell. Because at this point, all you have to do, people, hey neighbor, hey everybody, all you have to do is just have faith and faith alone. So it's this Protestant Reformation, Lutheranism, and the idea of I can be Christian and all I have to have is faith to be saved begins to trickle down into other areas in Europe, and eventually gets into France. And people are, sex, drugs, rock and roll. Everybody's having a great time because all I need to do is have faith and faith alone, and my sins will be forgiven. So in comes a new character by the name of John Calvin. And John Calvin goes, whoa, 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 cool your jet skis. No, that's wrong. You have to do good works. You have to incorporate sacraments. Now, Lutheranism also incorporates some sacraments, but Calvin still, he's putting the brakes on everybody being all, happy-go-lucky, and I can do anything, I can lie, cheat, and steal, and I'm still good. He puts the brakes on that. And he says, no, you can't do that. You do have to do good works. But he also comes in with this other concept that is still very relevant in Protestantism today, in the Presbyterian faith. And this is a concept of predestination. Now, predestination is this view of the world that Calvin creates, whereby God creates all human beings before Earth was even completed or before Adam's made. I mean, he makes all the human beings ever that are going to ever be on the planet Earth through all the time. I mean, just, ever. And when he makes all the people, he determines at the time that he makes them whether they're going to be saints or sinners, basically, whether they're going to go to heaven or whether they're damned. And when they're born, they don't know which one. So you better behave well in hopes that you're going to go to heaven. Now, but you can still be bad and still go to heaven. And you can still be great and still go to hell. So there's a lot to unpack in predestination that we really don't have the time to go into. But you must know about this. And with predestination comes the concept that no one, because you don't know if you're predestined to go to heaven or hell, everything you do is already predestined, and therefore you have no real free will. So the choices you make are not really, you think they're your choices, but they're not your choices, because God's already preordained what your choices are going to be. Your whole life has been preordained. And that, for a lot of people, it's kind of hard to swallow those concepts. I mean, think about it. You get pulled over by the police because you're speeding. And when the police say, do you know that you were speeding? And you say, well, look, God made me do it because I believe in predestination and I don't believe in free will. And therefore, I was speeding because that's just who I am. That's not going to go over very well, right? So do you have free will? Don't you have free will? What exactly is free will? So these are all ideas that you can have, conversations about, dialogue about for your life. I mean, honestly, there are millions of books about this. This is a very, very heady subject, and very heady topics that obviously in a 40-minute mini lecture, there's no way we're going to be able to cover them. But you do need to know they exist, okay? So Calvin is putting the brakes. Calvinists eventually, one group becomes what we are in the United States, or what becomes the Puritans, and they're a pretty tough group. So still, we see the spread in the time period that you're studying, the spread of these new ideas of Christianity, and the limits of Christian. Who believes whose version of Christianity is the right version of Christianity, and because once the split happens from Roman Catholicism to Lutheranism to Covenanters, or to what we have modern day Presbyterians, through Calvinists, everybody who believes whatever they believe that what they believe is the true faith. It is the true faith. So it's not just convenience. I mean, initially, perhaps for some Germans who take on Lutheranism, the regular everyday kind of folks, maybe it's just easier to be a Lutheran than it is to be Catholic. And that there's a lot to be said for that. But faith and religion is like emotional intelligence. It is part of, we'll fight to the death for that. It's not just, it's not necessarily rational. That's the truth. And what we see going forward when we get in further into the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, what we see are a series of wars that are fought between Christians, Catholics versus Protestants. And there's a lot of bloodshed in the name of God, Christian on Christian violence. And, we have Jews out, they're not even in the room where that happens, and Islam is nowhere to be found. So that it's important to remember that, because when we look, for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons is when we look at the First Amendment, where we have separation of church and state, it was only 100 years, but little over 100 years before our country was formed, that our founders had in their history the English Civil War, which was Catholics versus Protestants, and created a Protestant throne that still exists today. If you're going to be an English royal, you have to be Protestant. You cannot be Catholic. So it might not have been real fresh in their mind, but it's about as fresh in their mind as the Civil War is in ours. So, they were thinking about the amount of bloodshed over religion that was in their history. And so they took that issue off the table when they created the First Amendment to give everybody the ability to practice whatever faith they'd like to practice. So that's, there are ramifications of religion and religious beliefs and religious doctrine. And one of those ramifications is that when you believe something, you believe it to the core of your being, and you will fight for it. And then that brings us to the next conversation, which is how does religion influence what we think about the world, or does it influence the way we think about the world? Yes is the answer, but I'm speaking specifically more about how do we use religion as a means to understand a society. And the Renaissance art in Italy, that starts in Florence, Italy, it really helps us. It tells a tale. It tells a story of the everyday life of the people. And the art on the surface is backed by the church. It's financed by the church and wealthy family members in Florence. But religion, this is happening after the Protestant Reformations. After the Protestant Reformation happens, it does mess with Catholicism, Roman Catholicism. And eventually there's a schism in the church, and there are 4 popes. And what that schism does, what's important for our conversation here, is what that schism does is it makes people rethink about the power of the papacy, the power of the church, because what they see is a flawed church, because it is. You've got a schism, you've got issues, you have 4 men who are saying they're the Pope, and it really makes people reflect and say, maybe they're a bunch of hypocrites. And how do we know that? How do we know that some of these guys are saying that? Well, we see it in the art. So the church is very, very wealthy, and they help pay. They bring artists on board, and they support them. As I say, so do some of the very wealthy families in Florence. And so the church expects them to paint works of art that reflect godliness, or the church, the things that are important to the church, Jesus and Mary and Joseph. So on the surface of the art, that's what you see. You'll see these Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. But where people are placed, the 3D aspect of the painting, so the paintings are being created to reflect reality for the first time ever. The Renaissance gives us that. Renaissance art gives us this look into reality through art. And that reality is the reality of everyday people and the artists themselves, and how they're looking at the world around them. They're using their art as a metaphor for what they see in life, and what kinds of politics, and how people are living, and the hypocrisy of the church within the art, which is why art history is such an important subject to learn, because history is written by the victors. It's always been written by the victors. So how do we really know what truth is in history? How do we look beneath the surface of what is given to us to really understand the narrative of an everyday person? Well, one of those ways is through art, also through literature, poetry. These are windows, wonderful windows into the world of the regular people, and a reflection of the greater community. And Renaissance art does that. Renaissance art, on the surface, you see it's very, very religious on the surface. But you can look deeper into it, and great art historians can give you the story of what is actually happening in that painting. And it gives life to all the people who are in the painting. And the people who are in the painting are actually, in a Renaissance, real people. They're not like made up people. This is the first time we see models being used for portraits and for large scale paintings and frescoes. So the faces you see belong to real human beings. And so the clothes that you see are the clothes of the time. But there's a lot more depth in most of the art that begins to show up during the Renaissance. It's being painted during the Renaissance. And at the beginning of the Renaissance, what you find is art that looks very much religious. It's very religious. Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, Mosaccio, different artists you see at the beginning of the Renaissance, very Christian themes, very religious themes. But by the time you get to Botticelli, towards the end of the Renaissance, but the Venus, rising Venus out of a shell, she's all pagan. That's all pagan. So what happens in the Renaissance between the beginning of the Renaissance towards the end? You see the church being less and less and less important. And it's not that the church is not important. It just becomes less important. And so the daily lives of people are going to reflect that decline in religiousness. Because the Roman Church is having issues. The Roman Catholic Church is having issues during the Renaissance. What we also see in the art of the Renaissance are large benefactors, guys who are very wealthy benefactors who are supporting artists. And one of those benefactors is Cosimo Medici. And Cosimo Medici he really made a lot of money. And one of his jobs was being the banker to the Pope. And so, and the rest of his family in Florence, you can go to the palaces in Florence, to see the Medici Palace. Very important name, very corrupt family in many ways. But you can't, there's no one who's perfect. No one. Not now, not in the history that we study. And so when I say corrupt, that should just kind of go part and parcel with wealth and with power. It is very rare. It's not known, but it's very, very rare to ever not think that there's no corruption whatsoever. And I think that's it would be naive to think to think that, which then I believe you should then make the connection that if wealth and power also can bring about corruption in the past, can it in the future? Can it now? Can it in the future? Most definitely. With the wealth that Cosimo had, he was one of the people who created the modern banking system. And that started in Florence. So the foundations for the modern banking system arise. They are created during the period of the Renaissance in Florence, Italy. Another thing that's happening in Italy is in Venice. Now, Venice is a port city, as you know, canals, and they are traded. They were actually the port by which goods from the Ottoman Empire, from the Seljuk Turks, from the East came into Europe by and large throughout the majority of up to by the time the Portuguese and the Spaniards begin the Age of Exploration. Where do goods come? Well, they basically come through Venice. As a matter of fact, the Black Plague, comes from the Ottoman ships into Venice, and so and then spreads up into Europe. So Venice is a city-state, just like Florence is, Venetians, and they are very, very wealthy because they are the hub for where the trade comes in from the East. It is because the trade comes through Venice that it creates these trade routes. That's the only hub where the trade comes in. So by the time you see the first nation states of Spain and Portugal, the Age of Exploration bursts onto the scene because they want to avoid the middleman going through Venice. So the new ships, caravels, are built for trade along the African coast, coming up over the around the Cape of Good Hope and into India, and then the Portuguese make it all the way to Japan in the 1500s, but they are they are the keeper of the keys, if you will, of trade. The Venetians are. So the Spaniards don't want to go through, and the Portuguese don't want to go through Venice. They want to go directly to the source in order to get the goods, and also to get those goods at a direct price. Sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't work out. And as you go forward in your World History 2 class, you will get further into Age of Exploration. But it is important to know that those trade routes are very vast, and they have been around for thousands of years by the time the Age of Exploration begins. So during the Renaissance and the Reformation, a lot's happening. We've got religious changes. We've got wealth within Italy, not just through the church, but also through trade coming through. And so Italy is really the hub of the Renaissance, Florence in particular, but Italy is really the hub that creates the Renaissance, the rebirth, if you will. Now, with that rebirth, lastly comes, for our conversation, science, ideas and scientific. Leonardo da Vinci was a master scientist of his day, as well as a great artist. But we have the beginnings of the scientific revolution, where you have people who are members of the church, the Roman Catholic Church, because remember, they're going through a lot of issues ever since Martin Luther comes on the scene trying to reform the church. Within the confines of the church itself, it's trying to figure out its way. There's the schism with the four popes. And then there are a group of guys who believe that in order to really understand God's world, we need to study the world, and we see the rise of the humanists. And those guys they look at the leaves, they're looking at the world, they're really trying to understand it, because they believe that if they know the world, then they're going to really understand God better. And the scientific revolution creates new technology, which also eventually influences Western Europe. It really creates the foundations of early modern Europe. And concepts like germ theory and microscopes and things like that. So The Renaissance has a lot that's packed into it. The Reformation changes the dynamics of the religion of Christianity, totally changes the dynamic of Christianity. And with that change in the dynamic, one of the consequences are religious wars that influence the world, really. And some for good and some not for good. But definitely as you go forward in World Civ II, you'll see the influences of from the Renaissance and the Reformation. So for the discussion board for this week, I want you to think about what I just laid out here. Specifically, remember what I said about art in Italy at the beginning of the Renaissance, about its relationship to the church, and it being used as a metaphor of what's really happening in the everyday lives of people. In this discussion board, this last discussion board, I want you to tell me well, I know I had one thought, and then immediately I went to another thought. And if we were in a regular classroom, this would not be an awkward gap. But I think what I would rather you do is this. Because what I want you to do is, when you're thinking about what I spoke about earlier with not just art, looking through and what is the deeper meaning, think also about Martin Luther and what he was doing. He was protesting the church because he wanted to reform the church. And why was he doing that? Well, because corrupt. Who was it really hurting? The everyday people. So in what way, if you wanted to leave something for people in the future, acts that you're doing now, if you're out protesting Black Lives Matter, explain, what are you protesting? What are you attempting to reform? How can people in the future know or understand the more nuanced issues of everyday people? Renaissance art is a metaphor. On the outside, it looks like, basic Christianity, but you look deeper and you see the issues people faced. You look at the Protestant Reformation. Christianity was just Roman Catholicism. Everybody's tootling along. And then Martin Luther bangs this 95 Thesis on the door of the church, saying, no. This shows these 95 Theses go deeper into the community. It's a reflection of the issues the community is feeling. Can you think of anything that we're doing right now, or art, music, literature? In what ways do people in the future get an opportunity to see the real issues that are facing the everyday people in our country, but perhaps around the world? What are ways that we are projecting, telegraphing to the future the nuances, the everyday issues that we're facing, so that even if people at the top who write the history try to create their own narrative, how can we show people in the future, without being in their face, what the reality was? So that's really the question that I want you guys to answer. Okay, and remember, you need to make an answer by Saturday. And then you have to, the last answer, 2 more posts to other classmates by Tuesday. I look forward to reading them all. I will get all my grading up to speed here before the end of the week, and so that you can go into the last week of the summer session knowing exactly where you stand, okay? All right, so that's pretty much it. I'm available via email if you need me, and I hope that you are all appropriately behaving and keeping safe, and washing your hands and wearing your masks and social distancing, and that you remain safe and well, and that you are very happy and you're doing things that you enjoy during this summer. And I look forward to talking to you guys. Okay. Bye.